Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Super-Fanta-Fi. This being a show it's about TV shows of the supernatural, fantasy, and/or science fictional genre. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of The Time Traveler's Wife. Another great episode. A lot of really interesting things went down in this episode, so let's break it down. This is a hell of a way to open the episode. Like, the way they were setting it up, you're like, oh man, his mom is going to die. And the moment that, like, thing was, like, shaking in the back of the truck, I'm like, whoa, you're not going to do what I think you're going to do. And they did. That is brutal. It's like, once again, it's like HBO. They kind of don't hold back. I've never seen the movie, so I don't know if the movie really covers this. And I don't know, like, how, like, deep the movie does go over it, if it does cover it. But it's interesting because, really quickly, I know that, and I've only heard this because I might have talked about this recently. I think I might have brought it up last episode. But Kate Siegel was on the Inside of You podcast. It was actually a little bit before this show actually started airing, and she talked about this character. I've never read the book. She talks about the character of his mom, Henry's mom, like she's kind of almost not a throwaway character, but she's just kind of like such a background, off to the side character, like almost like she doesn't matter. But it seems like for the show they made her more of a character. And I don't know whether it's supposed to be an example of like this episode, because this entire episode mainly revolves around her, and I don't know if we'll get continuous stuff with her, because truth be told, Henry, we learn, pops in and out of his mom's life, like, over throughout the years, but really getting, like, I just think that's such an interesting thing. I mean, we've seen that from time to time. Like, I know a great example would be, like, in American Gods. I've never read the book, but a little bit I've read up about was that Mad Sweeney is barely a character. The character pops up maybe twice in the entire book. He's a main character the first 2 seasons. So that whole situation. So I think that's such an interesting thing when you're able to do that. So, getting into it, the tragedy of it. One of the greatest examples of man being a time traveler is garbage. It sucks. Especially for Henry, because he's been brought to at least a dozen times. He's been brought back to his mom's death at different points in time. I think the oldest age we saw amongst all the lists was 41, but he's been back there multiple times as a teenager. He went back there I mean, that's him at ages. We don't even know how many times he went back there at those ages, because we know he went there, obviously, he rewound himself a few moments before his mom died at 8. So he had to see it from a third perspective at 8. He went back at 10, 12, 17 in his teenage years. The oldest he was 41. So, and it's not just her death. He goes back to her funeral multiple times, too, because you'll constantly see different Henrys there, too. I'm like, that sucks. That sucks so much. And the oldest, and what appears to be the oldest Henry, which I'm assuming that's supposed to be Henry at 41, the one that's talking, which I would assume if that's him at 41, I assume that's like Claire at like 33, at that time when they're both recording those videos, but well, we never know. That could be a little bit younger in her timeline, and that could be, like, Henry in his furthest timeline where he's still alive, and that might be Claire's furthest timeline where Henry's still alive, or maybe, like, before he dies or after he dies. You never know, right? Well, he might be even older. Well, there's certain things that make me think he might not be older, because at his mom's funeral, one of his younger selves, I think it was him in his 20s, turns because another Henry dropped in, but it's him at 41, and he's kind of gasping, and I'm assuming that's the Henry that's severely hurt that doesn't survive. That's probably the one who lost his legs, maybe, that 28-year-old Henry found last episode. That might be his legs, and now it's just kind of like, oh, he's behind 20-something Henry dying at his mom's funeral, and it's like, right, so wherever that is, or at least that's nearing death Henry, maybe. He has a lot more gray hair than I would expect for someone at 41, but, I mean, obviously, like, I think a lot of people might go into their, like, silver hair, gray hair stage, you know, sooner than others, you know, but regardless. But that older Henry, the point I was making was, he kind of describes it as, you know, like, gravity, like, you know, I think for him, it's almost like the space-time continuum constantly, I guess it's almost like a fixed point in history in his personal life that is so like the gravitational pull is so strong that it pulls him in from different points in his life, always back to that moment. Once again, different positions, different perspectives, different views on his mom's death, knowing that day is a day. And even Claire's like, right, I can always tell just looking at his face when he goes back to that day, because Christmas is the worst day for Henry, and because that's the day his mom died. Well, it might have even been, wasn't it Christmas Eve that she actually died? That's heartbreaking. But it, and I thought it was interesting how Henry spun it to be like, right, his way to deal with the fact is that he's had to watch his mom die multiple times, how he had to live with that, is the fact is that he copes with it by being like, right, I've gotten to see it, and my mom, I got to meet her, so it's almost like she's both dead and alive all at once. And it's that interesting thing of, like, you know, how time is perceived some occasions, like time is happening all at once. And for a time traveler, it's kind of like that, where it's like, yeah, present day, I'm living in a time where my mom is dead, but I know that eventually I will time travel to another point where she is still alive. Post having me, pre having me, so... Because it all started with Henry telling Claire at age 6. She's like, right, what about your parents? And he's like, oh, my dad's a violinist and my mom was a singer. It's like, why'd your mom stop singing? He's like, what do you mean? She's like, you said was. He's like, my mom is a singer. And it's that time travel thing of like, well, technically she is still a singer, but she's also kind of a former singer. And it's like, right, you don't want to tell a 6-year-old about how you brutally lost your mom. It's like, because you're dealing with that and you're like in your 30s at this point in time, but you don't want to make a little girl be like, you know, you don't want to broach the conversation of death, because she's going to be worried about her own parents at that point in time. So Henry gives a very specific time and date, like, cool, I would tell you what makes me sad at this particular time. Young Claire calls him an asshole. It's like, which I guess is kind of her favorite thing to do. But I guess it's kind of everyone's favorite thing to do, because Henry will call himself an asshole as well. But they're on the train together at, he's 28, she's 20, and this is after their little debacle last episode. And it's like, right, regardless of what you try to do, you can't break away from this. Once again, the tragedy of everything's set in stone. Like, there is no fighting against it. Whatever choices you make, what's a choice you are always going to make. So there's no, it almost makes it, which... There's a beauty to that, but there's also like a kind of depressing sadness, because it's like, right, no matter what you do, he's always going to end up with Claire. Because there's also the messed up thing of like, he's like, oh, I don't want to, oh, that guy. He refers to his older version, the one that Claire fell in love with. I was like, oh, you're thinking about him. It's like, but that's you. He's like, yeah, but that's not me. That me is the one that went back in time and groomed you at 6 years old. But me, I'm me. You know, I'm not really tied. It's like, oh, I'm into blondes because my girlfriend is a blonde. That's how I stay faithful. You're like, Jesus. But like, the reason why I say it's this beautiful messed upness is because it's like, right, do you have any choices on who you fall in love with? Because it's like, right, are you priming yourself to fall in love with someone that you're going to fall in love with? It's like, it takes away choice. Like, do you really have any choice in the matter when everything is predetermined? That in the future, it's like, right, you make the choice to go left and you're thinking like, no, I'm gonna go right. It's like, no, you always go right. You try to think you're switching up on fate. It's like, nothing you do will play out like that. Everything is already laid out. Once again, kind of the like I said, all the time is happening all at once. The past, the present, and the future. The future has actually already happened, and so technically, the future is already happening, just like the past has already kind of happened. The future kind of already has too, because there's a further point in the future where the future becomes past. I'm saying that in the most convoluted way, but it's like, time travel gets you thinking about that, which I love time travel. It's probably one of my favorite things I love the most about science fiction is time travel, because I think it's such a cool concept. Granted, not the best thing if you're a minority. Like, there's only a small limit of space and time you can go back to without it being an issue. So there's that. But because I forgot where I was watching. Oh, I was watching something. Someone had did a poll of oh, would you rather time travel to the future, the past, or Paul's time? And I said oh, Paul's time. Future, because it's so unpredictable, you don't know what the hell that's going to be. And the past, once again, I'm black. Not the safest, not the safest skin tone. Once again, unless you're white. White's kind of the only skin tone to be, ethnicity to be, if you want to survive in any point in time. It's like I said, there's only a certain window of time you can really be okay as a black person without dealing with just extreme racism and all. We're going a whole tangent, but still. So there's the conversation of like I said, just like everything being set in stone is so fascinating, and just like there's a beauty to it, like I said, but there's also a darkness to that. And Claire's kind of dealing with that. She's like, no, I'll go here, and she's like chooses a different cafe because Henry's like, oh, we're gonna go here. Well, maybe he remembers it. Maybe like a future version of himself told him that, like, oh, we're gonna go here, because why he knew that they were gonna go to this particular spot, who knows? But when they go to the other cafe, it ends up being a place where Henry at 30-something told 6-year-old Claire, hey, I'll tell you the truth about myself, what makes me sad. Because for Henry, it's like people being happy is kind of boring because that makes everyone the same. But your sadness, the thing that sets you apart, makes you different, is what makes you sad. Because that's when you really get to know someone, is when you make something, when it's like what makes you sad, because that's you being vulnerable, that's you being open about something. So knowing what makes someone sad really tells you who they are, and it kind of separates you from everyone else, because everyone's got their thing that, you know, makes them sad, whether it's like the loss or just something that they've been through. And once again, diving into the whole conversation of the whole grooming aspect of it, that Claire is saying, like, right, my entire I've built myself, like, my libido around you. I've had a crush on, I've been in love with you since I was 6 years old. But now what is in front of me is a younger, hotter version of my ideal man. You know, and he's like, right, well, what do you want me to be? And he's like, right, you want me to be the older version of myself, which I'm not yet. So she gets Henry to open up about, once again, his mom, and once again, how he gets to see her. He got to see the day his mom and dad kind of like locked eyes for the first time during the performance, him being a violinist, her being a singer. Then also how he was there when they proposed, and he's actually bumped into them a few times. He's like, right, over the times that I've time traveled and bumped into him, they start recognizing a regular face. They're like, oh, we run into each other from time to time. So he kind of became friendly with his parents. And you could tell, like, she could tell there was something in Henry's, like, face, like, oh, what was up with him? He's like, no, I'm good. And she's like, oh, how'd you get that scar? He's like, stupid accident. I thought the scar might have been from, like, the shoes or something. It's like, I think maybe he had lied to say that last episode, but truth be told, as we now know, the scar came from the car accident. And now being in front of his mom with that too. Because he also talks about it later, that thinking about his mom, like, he can't 100% control where he goes, but when he focuses so much on his mom, when he gets stressed, when he gets depressed, like, it kind of tends to pop him into that time where his mom died. That's usually the place he loathes going the most. Any other point in time with his mom, it's still the reality of knowing, like, oh man, this is me at 1 year old. My mom's going to die 7 years from now. Like, knowing the specific date, that not only is it stuck in your memory because you could never forget it, but you have to relive that trauma over and 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 over again. Once again, we saw a dozen different ages up there, but we don't even know if that's because some of those ages he could have gone back multiple times. Like, once again, he experienced the death firsthand at 8, but he saw it on almost instant replay from a third perspective a few seconds early when he accidentally time traveled because his body just kind of reacted that way. So that's jacked up. And obviously there's the whole conversation about, can you change anything? And Henry's tried to change things, but it doesn't always work out. We didn't really get too much into it this episode, but it is like, right, when you try to change things. Henry at 28 told his 8-year-old self, hey, because this is the 8-year-old who fairly recently lost his mom. His mom had died like a couple months beforehand, I think. It's still a super fresh wound. And Henry's very dismissive of it because he's almost like, yeah, kid, I get it. Your mom's dead. You know, mine's dead too because we're the same person. And I've had to see it over and over again. You've had to deal with it, technically twice. It's like, no, technically twice, but it was the same time frame, so it wasn't too crazy, but still, you kind of saw the impact firsthand, and then you popped out, saw it from an outside perspective, then popped into the aftermath. So yes. So he's almost like, yeah, kid, come to me after you've seen it like 50 times. So he's a little harsh towards him because he's like, right, I need you to shut up and listen to me. I'm going to teach you everything you need to be prepared for the future. Stealing wallets and how to go about it, learning how to survive. Because time traveling isn't always the easiest. Like, the situations he finds himself in. Sometimes they're kind of like, oh, funny, embarrassing. Of like, oh, I popped up here naked. And we see at one point in time he's locked in a cage and people are poking and prodding him with like those cattle prods, it seemed like. So I don't, you know, and he's kind of hiding, so people are probably trying to hunt him down, either from a police perspective of like, oh man, this guy showed up like a nudist, or whether people, who knows what that cage situation was, whether that's just some weirdos that sound like, oh, we're going to cage you up, boy, we're going to zap you, haha, we enjoy torturing people. I'm assuming he got out of that situation when he just naturally time traveled and got out of that, or who knows. So it's probably stuff like that he tries to prepare for. It's like, man, this show just leans into the god-awful, because everything else kind of leans into like the more joyous fun, you know, whether it's a Doctor Who, Legends of Tomorrow. The only other thing that really dives in, like, even 12 Monkeys doesn't go into like the garbage elements of time travel, just like, oh, how much that sucks. Heroes, like 12 Monkeys, Legends of Tomorrow, and all that time travel stuff, they'll lean into it for story plot purposes and just like, oh, you know, how they use it, but never into like the very depressing angle. Because his case of time travel is more uncontrollable, whereas like, oh, those other cases were time travel where you can kind of control where you go. So that is interesting. Because they also, because of the whole angle of he can see his mom and his dad before they even really got together, it shows that he can kind of go outside his own timeline to some extent. But once again, he does time travel to the future, but it is very rare. But I guess it's because it is his mom and dad, and it's still part of his life, because it's still part of his time, because, like, right, them getting together births you, so of course you get to enjoy that history. But it makes, I would assume that's referencing he never gets to see him, like, he never gets to meet his mom as a kid or his dad as a kid. So that's a whole thing. But right, 28-year-old Henry is trying to teach his 8-year-old self, like, okay, what you're going to do is, in about a minute, you're going to run in that direction. He's like, fine, I won't. Because Henry's starting to think, like, right, so if I can time travel back to that moment, I could save my mom. I was like, no, you can't. It's unchangeable. We're kind of stuck going down the paths that we're destined to. And he's like, no, I'm not going to move. We're going to stay here. Because he's like, if I can stay here, that means I can change it. That means I can save my mom. But what ends up happening is, he ends up seeing his mom, and he runs towards her, because this is a point in time where she's still alive. It's a couple months before she died. And so, because she dies like Christmas Eve, and this particular time, it's like June of 1988, right? Because it's like 1989 now. So it's a couple months before his mom died. And so he rushes over to his mom, but his mom chastises him because time and time again he's gotten in trouble as a kid because no one knew what was going on, his mom nor his dad. So he would time travel, leave his clothes behind, but it just seems like he's skipping school. And they're like, oh, what's up with this whole leaving your clothes behind thing? So she's mad at him because it's like he's trying to talk to her, but she doesn't want to listen because she's getting frustrated because it's like, you've done this 10 times now. And he's like, please, Mom, I got to explain something to you. And he does explain it to her. He's like, I'm a time traveler. What I'm going to do is save your life. But she's like, stop it. She says, stop, stop, stop. And she yells at him, and he yells back at her. He calls her. He says, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you. And Henry, at 28, it breaks his heart because he knows, like, right, this is one of the final conversations he's going to have with his mom. He knows, like, not final conversation, but she's going to remember this conversation. He's not, because when she eventually asks Henry about it later on, he's going to be, like, so confused. Henry at 8 is like, right, I remember. And I was like, right, I didn't know what she was talking about. Because she'd even called up his dad being like, wait, what do you mean he was at school? Like, how did he get here? So I just saw him, so now it is a situation of like, he's like, I could go tell her now. And for Henry at 28, he's like, no, you can't. You can't go, you can't, something will always happen. So once again, that was on her, but we haven't really gotten into the ins and outs of what actually happens that tries to, I'm sure it's like the space-time continuum of, you know, everything's predetermined and it has to play out a certain way, but I wonder, is it going to be like a Final Destination thing of, you know, once again, that's a very, I referenced that in a review, one of the reviews for today, but like, his mom's death is pretty, I didn't say at the beginning, but it's like, that's a very Final Destination death. It's way bloodier and brutal than you would think, but I was thinking, like, the reason why I'm bringing that up, I was thinking Final Destination style. Without killing him, something would always get in his way where it's like, oh, maybe he's going to try and catch up with his mom and a crowd just happens to get in his way. Or like, oh, maybe she got on a train and he just happens to miss the train that she got on. Like, I'm assuming it's going to be stuff like that that gets in the way. And so... it's for that Henry, it's like, right, I wanted to save my mom. She had just died. Now I'm getting to see her, you know, because this is a couple months beforehand. She's alive. And what did I do? I got so frustrated because she yelled at me and she was just frustrated that I said that I hate her. And I said that knowing she's gone and like, I want to make this right. But he's like, you can't. And 28-year-old him is trying to tell him it's not your fault. And eventually explains to him, I'm you. It's like shows off the birthmark on the foot. The marks on their legs from their surgeries, even the scar on his head. And Claire's also hearing all of this too, knowing like, wait, the time traveler you told me about, that, like, right, there are no multiple time travelers. It's just you from multiple times. You trained yourself in the long run. And I even love the line from Henry being like, I misled myself. Because it was a situation of, yes, I was making you believe there were multiple time travelers, so that were other people out here with experience that you could probably turn to. It's like, no, all you have is yourself. And even Henry talks about, like, no, it's actually kind of interesting to be able to talk to yourself. Because we also end up finding out his dad found out about the time travel thing at 16. I thought what's happening was like, oh my God, like someone's blowing you and you're about to time travel and your dad's about to see that. But I was like, oh, wouldn't that other person see it too? Oh, the person that was blowing him was himself. It was 16-year-old him saying, blowing 16-year-old himself too. I was like, wow, it's not gay, it's masturbation. You know, it's kind of like, I forgot what that joke was from. I think that was a Robot Chicken joke. I want to say it was Hal Spark. He was like, oh, like he's making out with like a life-size version of himself. He's like, it's not gay, it's masturbation. God, that's early 2000s, like Robot Chicken too. I'm trying to think. Yeah. I want to say it was Hal Sparks that said that. You know, he voiced it, but I think it was, regardless. So it is kind of messed up. It's like, wow, you went... He's like, yeah, I was 16. It's like... It's that thing of like, right, if you could fuck yourself, would you? I mean, who would know... I mean, who would know what you like better than you, right? Because it's a whole other level of like, this is some next level masturbation. It's probably like... Makes you wonder, you go like, would it be like the best sex you ever had? Be kind of weird if it was. Because it's like, man, because you could never... I mean, you could replicate it, but... There's also a line from the previous episode, in episode 1, where he referenced like an older version of himself. It's like, yeah, that's the guy I fucked or something like that. I was like, oh, you meant that? Like, I took that as like a masturbation joke or something like that. It's like, which I guess technically this would be too, but it's like, oh, you meant that literally? You've literally fucked yourself. Okay, wow, that's interesting. But that's also, you know, it's like, it's still you, but it's like, would you from a different point in time technically be considered a different person? I think you can kind of theoretically like break down that conversation. I think it's still you because it's all you, but you are a different person with every experience. So like there's a new you every day. The you today isn't the you that existed 10 years ago. I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago to some extent. Yes, on a genetic, that whole thing, but personality wise and stuff like that. So it is interesting. So it's like technically you fucked yourself, but technically you didn't. I think that's a whole deeper level conversation, but I thought it was also interesting too, where Henry was like, oh, do you want to meet my mom? I'm gonna give you an opportunity. Well, take her to where he works and stuff. And he's like, cool, there's all these history books here. He's like, there's a good chance I might be in one of these books. At some point in the future, I might go back in time in the past, and something I ended up getting recorded in one of these books. And they're somewhere on these shelves, and I won't even know that. I'm like, dude, that's mind-boggling, because it's like, cool, I could know my future, but I wouldn't know what books to look through to find it, especially because there's so many books here, and there's a possibility that some future version of me went back in time and got captured on camera during some historic event, or just someone taking pictures. It's like, it's kind of wild to think about. So, Henry asks Claire, does she want to see, talk to his mom, and so he... plays a recording of her singing, which I think is so interesting. Once again, I highly recommend if you haven't listened to it, listen to the Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum podcast, where he talks to Kate Siegel. So about the whole opera scene, I couldn't help but kind of smile and laugh just because when she talks a little bit about her and singing, and I couldn't help but, like, now I'm thinking that the entire time. that she's just like lip syncing that, because I think that's not even her like singing, but it's because like she had talked a little bit about it. I don't remember everything that she said, but she was just like, oh, she's more comfortable like lip syncing to something rather than actually trying to sing something. So it's not even her recorded singing the opera, it's someone else, and she's just lip syncing to it. And like she jokes about it a little bit. I thought that was so interesting. Like, look, once again, I highly recommend. It's really fascinating to hear her perspective on acting and everything like that. So. Also, I highly recommend, if you haven't seen Midnight Mass, you should. It's fantastic. I need to go back and watch the others, like Haunting of Bly Manor and Hill House. I've not watched them. Midnight Mass was actually the first one I saw. Tangents and on that side. I love that the moment he's like, right, she's like, right, me listening to your mom isn't going to be me, getting to speak to her, and it's like, okay, no, if you could ask her any question, what would you do? I was like, oh, dude, this is going to be trippy. And she's like, okay, it would be this. And he keeps playing it because she does a Q&A section at the end. It's like, right, this answer goes out to Claire, even says Claire's last name. Claire was like, what the fuck? How did that happen? Could she hear me? It's like, no. Eventually, at some point in time in the future, a version of me is whenever I see my mom next in the future, future me time travels back to this point, I'm going to ask my mom this question on your behalf, and this way you get to know my mom, because you get to ask her a question about like, how do we get together. And I even love this whole thing, the answer that she gives. She's like, the play I'm doing right now, the song I'm singing is about love being doomed. That there's this obviously beautiful tragedy to love, that love isn't forever, that love, you will eventually lose someone. But essentially, it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. Because love can be so fleeting. So that's why when you have that opportunity, sometimes it might, come at a much later time. But why wait? Just jump on it while you can, because you will eventually lose it. Because that's a terrible thing of like getting together. Love is all about when it ends. It will end eventually. Whether it is just, oh, you're breaking up, or whether it's death separating you from the person you love. But it shouldn't take away from the fact is that it is important, that it shouldn't take away from the good times. Like, we're getting a little personal here. Like, I've talked about it a little bit. I've looked back on relationships negatively. Now that I'm a little older, a little more perspective, I can look back on the good times of those relationships. I don't regret, like, being so madly in love with someone. Like, I'm never going to regret that, and the experiences and a lot I learned about myself. And, so I'm never going to regret that. And I think that's beautiful in the regard of, like, when it comes to Henry, because Henry's like, yeah, I'm an asshole. The reason why I'm the way I am with relationships is, like, he had to, because being a time traveler, he will, like, getting close to people means losing them over and over again. What he had with his mom, that could happen over and over and over again. I mean, we never really went into it, and maybe we will in the future, but him and his dad apparently aren't on speaking terms. He's like, why would we talk? He's like, so his dad knows about his circumstances, but for whatever reason, they don't talk. I don't know whether that's supposed to be indicative of, I know so much about my future that me and my dad don't need to talk, because I don't know whether that's what that's indicative of or not. Because who knows at 28 how often Henry's going to the future at this point in time or not. But a lot of that, like that talk about like love being doomed, I've been that person. I was that high schooler who wrote poetry as a teenager, yeah. And I remember a girlfriend being like, oh, did you write that poem about us? Like, oh, we're not going to break up. Yes, we eventually broke up. But it's like, the fact is I can be pessimistic when it comes to relationships, because I'm always like, oh, that's my own shit I've had to deal with and stuff like that. But that whole conversation about love being doomed, but also, once again, it's better to love and then lost than never have loved at all. I am a sucker for romance. And now that I'm even older, and it's a lesson I've talked about time and time again when it comes to romance, when it comes to love, that yes, you can't have love without hurt, but hurt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Hurt helps you grow, because it also makes you realize the only reason why you hurt is because you love. I'm not saying hurt, oh man, it's so awesome, it's so great. No, it sucks. But it's a part of life. It's part of, you can't have love without that, because if you're not hurting after losing someone, then it almost feels like, oh, did you really love them? That hurt means like it was something important to you, So that's my perspective as I've gotten older. Once again, it's a perspective I've gotten from a video game, but still, like, you know, there's still plenty you can learn from anime, video games, comics, and TV shows and whatnot. There's life lessons you can still pull from that in many different regards, but regardless, I think this right here is where things start to shift, you know, for Claire. It's where she starts to see Henry, and this is where Henry kind of opens himself up to Claire, and I think this is where things really start. It's going to be interesting considering, like, he's still got a girlfriend currently, so how that's going to play out, it's definitely going to be interesting. I'm excited to see where this story ends up taking us next. I'm very thoroughly enjoying this ride. Once again, this is my first time with this story, so I'm going into this not really sure what to expect, but obviously Henry's got that looming blade over his neck, but he had told, like he was telling his young self, it's like, right, your mom is there, but it, like, because he's worried, because he's like, oh my god, mom's about to fall into traffic or something, but someone grabbed her, but he's like, and Henry at 20 had to remind him, it's okay, she will die, but it's not today. Same thing he has to remind himself when he saw his legs last episode being separated. It's like, right, the blood, the pain, whatever I'm in, that's going to be, that's in the future, but it's not today. Today is just today. That's tomorrow, and, you know, hopefully tomorrow's not the day, but as long as today's not the day, I got to keep that in mind. That's the only thing that kind of keeps you going, keeps your sanity about knowing, like, right, whatever you're going to experience in the future, you're not going to survive it. You know at some point you're going to, like, everyone has a clear definition of eventually they're going to die. It's a little bit different when you're a time traveler, and it's literally kind of staring you in the face, so I am very, very excited to ultimately see where all of this ends up taking us going forward into the next episode. But really, that's all I'm going to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day, and good